Hexes and Halberstadts, my First World War aerial wargame rules. When I was a boy, in common with many of my contemporaries, I was fascinated by aerial warfare. Being English, I was of course brought up on tales of the Battle of Britain, and gloried in the triumph of the heroic few who defeated the overwhelming might of the assembled Luftwaffe. But much as I enjoyed watching all those films set in the summer of 1940, and building Airfix models of Spitfires and Hurricanes, and even the occasional Messerschmitt, the era of aerial combat that most fascinated me was the First World War. One thing that attracted me to that era was the aesthetics of the aeroplanes. A Spitfire is a beautiful thing, but it looks as if it has been built in a factory by machines. It is impersonal. On the other hand, the aircraft of the First World War look like something that has been put together piece by handcrafted piece in a shed at the bottom of somebody's garden. They are more human somehow, and so I feel more of an emotional attachment to them. For the same reason, I prefer the wooden-hulled sailing warships of earlier times to the steel-built, steam-powered battleships of the 20th century. But let's not get too misty-eyed about it. These aircraft may have been flimsy and underpowered, but they were nonetheless lethal. I was interested in them primarily because they were weapons of war, and war has always fascinated me. I read about Albert Ball and Manfred von Richthofen and admired their bravery and proficiency. I wondered what it would have been like to pilot one of those unreliable, fragile and inflammable flying machines with no parachute into a situation where an enemy, very possibly in a superior aircraft, was doing his level best to kill me with his twin machine guns. How long would I have lasted? In all truth, probably not very long at all. Being even then of a wargaming persuasion, the next step was to play wargames based on the combat I had been reading about. Back in the day, there was an Avalon Hill board game called Richthofen's War, which allowed me to do just that, and I spent many happy hours doing so. And then I grew up and moved on to other things. Many years passed, but earlier this year I got nostalgic for the aerial wargames of my youth. My old copy of Richthofen's War is long gone, and in any case there were several aspects of that game that dissatisfied me, so I decided to write my own set of rules. These are the rules called Hexes and Halberstadts, which are set out in this video. The first question I considered in designing the rules was movement, in particular whether I wanted to use free-form movement or use a playing area divided into hexes or a grid. Normally, I prefer free-form movement. However, a key factor in aerial combat is the relative manoeuvrability of the aircraft involved. Trying to capture things like different turning circles in a free-form movement system was likely to result in something extremely complicated, probably using different movement templates for each aircraft, and I just didn't want to spend time on all that, whether in preparing all the templates or in actually using them during a game. So I decided that in this case some sort of hex or grid system was the way to go, and that rather than trying to directly model relative manoeuvrability on the tabletop, I would instead capture it through other mechanics. I then had to choose between a hex-based system or a chessboard-like grid. The advantage of a grid is that it allows an aircraft to have 8 possible facings rather than the 6 facings you get with hexes. The disadvantages are that you then have to distinguish between orthogonal and diagonal movement and fields of fire, which adds complexity, which I didn't want. So hexes it was. I then thought about altitude. This is clearly crucial in aerial combat, so the rules had to allow for it. But too granular an allowance adds complexity to movement and firing and is more challenging to track and record during the game. I therefore decided to use a relatively small number of broad altitude bands. At this stage, I started thinking about playing pieces. Was I writing a miniatures wargame, using little model aeroplanes, or a hex-based board game, using counters to represent aircraft? Having had a look at the model aircraft that are available on the market, and the time required to paint them and what have you, I decided that using counters would enable me to play with more aircraft types with less preparation time. It also makes it easier to stack aircraft flying at different altitudes in the same hex. Each aircraft is therefore represented in the game by a 20mm by 15mm counter, on which is pasted a piece of paper showing a picture of the aircraft type and its vital statistics as used in the game. Having said that, although this video will assume that you're using counters to represent aircraft, if you want to play Hexes and Halberstadts using little model aeroplanes, it would be easy to do so. The next thing I thought about was activation. One of the things I really did not like about Richthofen's war was the way one aircraft would activate, perform a complicated set of manoeuvres so as to get into a position to fire on another aircraft, which meanwhile obligingly remained stationary, waiting its turn to move, and when its turn to move came, it would return the favour. The whole point about a dogfight is that everyone is moving at once, and things become very unpredictable. That sort of I go, you go activation mechanism completely fails to capture that. I decided to address this in two ways. Firstly, to severely limit the distance and number of manoeuvres an aircraft could make in a single activation, and secondly, to introduce more randomness into when aircraft activated and what they could do once activated. This randomness could also be used to capture the varying manoeuvrability of aircraft by making it more likely that a manoeuvrable aircraft would successfully complete a desired manoeuvre as compared to a less manoeuvrable aircraft. The system I came up with was a card-based system using a standard pack of playing cards. The idea is that each aircraft in the game has a number assigned to it, between 1 and 13. Then, for each aircraft, take the 4 playing cards with that number. So, for example, for aircraft number 3, take the 3 of diamonds, the 3 of hearts, the 3 of spades, and the 3 of clubs. The cards corresponding to each aircraft are then put together into the so-called action deck. The game is divided into rounds. At the start of each round, the action deck is shuffled. The cards in the action deck are then turned over one at a time. When a card corresponding to a particular aircraft is turned, that aircraft can attempt an action. The action that can be attempted depends upon the suit of the card. Whether or not an attempted action is successfully completed will normally depend on a die roll. Once all the cards have been turned, the round ends. Having provided you with an overview of the system, we now need to get into the details of the different actions that can be taken and which cards they correspond to. There are 5 different actions that an aircraft can take. These are move, dive, climb, turn, and fire. These actions are purposefully simple and few in number, so they are easily remembered in gameplay, which keeps the game moving. I will now describe each of them in turn. When an aircraft takes a move action, it moves 1 hex directly forward and can, but does not have to, change its facing by 60 degrees, that is 1 hex side, to the left or to the right. A dive action is the same as a move action, but the aircraft also reduces its altitude by 1 level. An aircraft that climbs does not move or change its facing, but increases its altitude by 1 level. An aircraft that turns stays in its current hex at its current altitude, but changes its facing by 60 degrees, either left or right. Firing is, I think, self-evident. I will cover the detailed rules on firing later. The ability of the aircraft to take these actions is determined by the following key statistics: speed, dive, maneuverability, ceiling, and attack. These statistics are shown on an aircraft's counter, as you can see on screen. In designing the game, I was keen to avoid any off-table record keeping. Keeping the number of key metrics to a level where they could all be recorded on an aircraft's counter was key to achieving this, along with the approaches taken to recording altitude and allowing for damage to an aircraft, which we will come to later. To cover each of the statistics in more detail, speed is a number between 1 and 6 inclusive, calculated by taking the maximum speed of the aircraft measured in miles per hour, dividing it by 11, rounding the result to the nearest whole number, and subtracting 6. So, for example, an aircraft with a maximum speed of 120 miles per hour would have a speed value of 5, calculated as 120 divided by 11, which is 10.9, rounded to 11 less 6, which equals 5. Dive is a whole number between 1 and 6 inclusive, representing how quickly the aircraft can lose altitude. Maneuverability is a whole number between 1 and 6 inclusive, representing how easy the aircraft is to maneuver and how quickly it can climb. Aircraft with a maneuverability of 1 are the least maneuverable, while those with a maneuverability of 6 are the most maneuverable. Some purists may point out that an aircraft that can climb quickly may well not be able to turn sharply, and they would be right. But, as far as I can tell, in many cases there is a reasonable degree of correlation between the two, and I wanted to keep the number of statistics to a minimum. If this offends you, then you can use 2 different numbers to capture the ability of an aircraft to turn and its ability to climb. But I didn't. Ceiling is the maximum altitude level that can be attained by the aircraft. It is calculated by taking the actual service ceiling of the aircraft measured in meters and dividing it by 800, rounding the result to the nearest whole number. An aircraft cannot climb to an altitude level higher than its ceiling. At the other extreme, if an aircraft's altitude reduces to 0 at any point during a game, it is assumed that the aircraft has crashed and been destroyed. This is a good opportunity to talk about how I indicate each aircraft's altitude during a game. I wanted to do this in a way that avoids any off-table record keeping and makes the altitude of each aircraft clear at a glance. The solution I came up with was to use some casualty markers that I purchased from war bases. The counter representing each aircraft is placed atop a casualty marker showing its altitude level. As the aircraft moves, so does the casualty marker. As the aircraft climbs or dives, the altitude level indicated by the casualty marker is adjusted accordingly. As well as allowing altitude to be easily recorded and changed, the casualty marker is also labelled with the number of the aircraft, enabling it to be readily identified when one of its cards is turned. That leaves attack value. Each aircraft has 2 attack values, representing the number of machine guns that can be fired by the pilot and the number of machine guns that can be fired by the observer if the aircraft carries one. Generally speaking, those guns fired by the pilot will be firing forward, and those fired by the observer will be the rear firing guns, and references to forward-firing and rear-firing machine guns should be interpreted accordingly. The table on screen sets out key statistics for a number of different types of aircraft. These numbers have been put together by me using various sources and a certain amount of subjectivity. You may therefore wish to make some adjustments based on your own views as to the relative performance of these aircraft types. Okay, so now we bring all this together, and I will explain what actions can be attempted on the turn of each card, how the statistics are used, and the reasoning behind this. When the heart corresponding to a particular aircraft is turned, so for aircraft number 3, that would be when the 3 of hearts comes up, that aircraft may attempt to move, dive, climb, or turn. Only one of these actions can be attempted. If the aircraft doesn't want to do anything, it can choose to do nothing at all. To successfully attempt an action, the aircraft must roll less than or equal to the relevant statistic on a single 6-sided die. So, to take a move action, the aircraft must roll less than or equal to its speed. To dive, it must roll less than or equal to its dive number. And to climb or turn, it must roll less than or equal to its maneuverability. If the roll is higher than the relevant statistic, then no action is taken and the next card is turned from the action deck. There is one special case. If the aircraft is attempting to turn and rolls a 6, then it spins out. Roll another die. Rotate the aircraft that number of hex faces in a clockwise direction and reduce the aircraft's altitude by 1 level. Note that even if an aircraft has a maneuverability of 6, then on a roll of 6 it will fail to turn and spin out in this way. The next suit to consider is diamonds. When the diamond corresponding to a particular aircraft is turned, then the aircraft must take a movement action. Note that this action is automatic. It is not diced for. This reflects the fact that an aircraft, even when it is gliding, will always have a certain forward velocity. After the aircraft has moved in this way, it can, but does not have to, attempt a single dive action. This is diced for as previously described. So, the red cards relate to movement and manoeuvre actions. The black cards relate to firing. In particular, when the spade corresponding to a particular aircraft is turned, that aircraft may fire its forward armament at any suitable target. The rear armament can be fired when the corresponding club is turned. If an aircraft has no forward armament, remove its spade from the firing deck. Similarly, if it has no rear armament, remove its club. The process for resolving firing is as follows. Firstly, an aircraft can only fire at another aircraft that is at the same altitude as the firing aircraft and in its field of fire. The field of fire for forward and rear firing guns is shown on screen. Note that an aircraft cannot fire at another aircraft that is in the same hex. Each hex within the field of fire is marked with a number, being 10, 11 or 12. This is the firing number. Take the relevant firing number and modify it as follows. If the aircraft has 2 machine guns firing in the relevant direction, that is, it has an attack value of 2, reduce the firing number by 1. If the firing aircraft is in one of the single line of hexes that are directly to the rear of the target aircraft, and both aircraft are flying in the same direction, then reduce the firing number by 1. Once the firing number has been calculated, then roll 2 dice. If they sum to the firing number to exactly the firing number, then the target is destroyed and removed from play. If they sum to a number that is within one of the firing number, then the target is damaged. So, for example, if the adjusted firing number is 10, then the target would be destroyed on a roll of 10. It would be damaged on a roll of 9 or 11, and on a roll of 12 or of 8 or less, then the firing would have no effect. If the dice rolled sum to 3, then the firing aircraft's guns have jammed or run out of ammunition. Remove the card that has just been turned, and so prompted the firing, from the action deck for the rest of the game. When an aircraft is damaged for the first time, permanently remove its heart from the action deck. So, if aircraft number 3 was fired at and damaged, the 3 of hearts would be removed from the action deck for the rest of the game. If an aircraft is damaged a second time, then it is destroyed and removed from play. This mechanism restricts the ability of a damaged aircraft to manoeuvre, but without requiring any off-table record keeping of the damage sustained. That is the basic rules of the game covered. I'm going to now quickly talk about some special rules and then make some final observations about playing the game. The first special rule relates to mid-air collisions. At the end of each round, roll a die for each aircraft that is in the same hex and at the same altitude as another aircraft. If a 6 is rolled, then the rolling aircraft is destroyed. If a 5 is rolled, then the rolling aircraft is damaged. Otherwise, that aircraft is okay. Note that this does mean that two aircraft can collide in such a way that one of them is destroyed or damaged and the other is not significantly affected. But based on my reading, such scenarios did occur, and an example of this would be the death of Oswald Bölker. The next rule relates to FE2Bs and Roland C2s, which have non-standard fields of fire for their rear armament, as shown on the screen. The final special rule relates to aces and green pilots. When an ace is firing, reduce the firing number by 1. If a green pilot is firing, increase the firing number by 1. Further, when rolling to turn, an ace can, but does not have to, increase or reduce the number rolled by 1. So, if the ace rolls a 5, that can be taken as a 4, 5 or 6, as the rolling player prefers. Note that this means that aces never spin, unless of course they want to. Also note this only applies when rolling to turn, not for any other action. In a campaign, a pilot is classified as a green pilot until he has flown 3 missions, or until he becomes an ace, if sooner. To become an ace, a pilot must destroy 5 aircraft by firing at them. Destroying aircraft by colliding with them does not count. As far as the rules go, that's it. But before ending this video, it is worth commenting on the scope of these rules. Hexes and Halberstadts is a game of close-quarter dogfighting. Each round represents a duration of a few seconds. Aircraft therefore move relatively slowly across the board. This is not a rule set to use for pre-dogfight manoeuvring, flying by a circuitous route to gain a height advantage on your opponent so that you can make a surprise attack on them from out of the sun. If you set up the opposing forces a great distance apart, intending to manoeuvre in this way, you will find that it takes an awfully long time for contact to be made and battle commence, an awfully long time during which you may become dreadfully bored. I would therefore recommend that for game purposes you assume that all that manoeuvre has already happened and set up your opposing forces, say 6 hexes apart from each other, so they can get stuck into combat quickly. That is where the fun is. I hope you found these rules interesting. There should be enough information in this video for you to give them a go. If you have any questions on the rules, then please ask them in a comment below and I will respond. That way others who may have similar questions will be able to see the answers. I do find that when playing a game it helps to have the rules written down, and I have therefore written down the rules of Hexes and Halberstadts, primarily for my own use. If you would like a PDF of this document, which also contains some example aircraft statistics and designs for counters, then send an email to the channel's email address and I will email it back to you. That's all I have to say on Hexes and Halberstadts for the moment. Thank you for watching and goodbye for now.